All right. Hello, everyone. We're live. This is our final Flutter Engage session. If you've stuck through with us for the other two, we definitely appreciate you attending this last one. We're going to have two parts to this session today. First is going to be a talk by Luke, and then Chris Sells will be joining us from from Google for a Q&A session as well. To give you a quick intro to Luke, he is a mobile engineer hailing from Maine. He has been a heavy contributor to the Flutter community over the last couple of years. He's actually currently the lead maintainer for Fluro, which is a popular routing package. He has a diverse background spanning from consumer software to physical product design. He is a lead maintainer, again, of Fluro and Sprung as well, which is a library for creating realistic animations. And we'll let him take this over.
All right. I am going to switch up my resolution on my computer and then I'm going to share. We're going to try this. If the text is too small, just let me know, okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, you guys all set?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So my talk today is, I can't remember what the exact title is, but it's basically unusual architectures that deliver. And we're going to be looking at two. And we're going to take a quick look at a Firebase architecture that relies solely on extension methods to be able to build out service classes. And this is going to be like a super quick high level look at how you kind of put it together. And I don't expect it to take more than 5 minutes. And this one's interesting because since you have all of these Firebase services, pretty much any Firebase service that you add to it, you can apply this method to it to get moving really quickly in an app in a way that's actually like pretty remarkably scalable, and all the separation, it's got all those good separations of concerns you're kind of looking for. So this one is actually available in a repo on my GitHub. It's called FB_Arch. And I'm just going to do a super quick walkthrough on this one. I recently used this to build a list app, and I found it to be incredibly fast to build. So the basic idea is you take something like, or you take for your public methods, you would go ahead and do an extension on user. And in this case, I've actually built kind of a little wrapping.
Luke, can you make the text a little bit larger? Sorry.
Absolutely. Give me 1 second.
Thank you. Much better. Thank you.
That working out for you?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome. All right. So in this case, the basic idea, I'm just going to back up for a second. The basic idea is you put all of your public methods on Firebase app, and then you put all of your private methods, all of your authenticated methods on user. And so this is an example of it being on user. So you can see you have things like my public info, update my public info, and these are all authenticated actions, like update your avatar. And these wrap the base, like Firebase service classes that have extensions on them. So if we go into user public info, you'll see here we have extensions on the Firebase database class. And so you got your references, user public info. And what this is this allows you to get any user's public info, for example. And then you can like update user public info, but of course that would have rules applied to it so that you couldn't do that unless you're authenticated. And then being able to fetch user private info, that would be on your self-authenticated. So you can see here that you kind of come in and you're like, okay, so we got Firebase database. What's important? We got our references, so we'll make extensions for that. We've got our methods, we'll make methods for that. And then when it comes time to access them, there's a few ways to do it, but the way that I've found that I enjoy is I make a basic mixin that accesses the static instances. And then you can actually mix it in on any class you can think of. So it kind of gets rid of the need for just like bringing it in as a variable or value every time you want to access these things. And I'll just give a real quick example of that here. So you can see here we've got like a login screen, and then we just mixed in with Firebase services. And because of that, we're allowed to access things like authentication and all sorts of other things. This example I didn't build out all the way, but you can see here that you'd be able to fetch, you'd get the user, private user info, public user info, and you can act on all that stuff. So just real quick, I'll give you some example of some of the some of the things you can do with these extensions. So like, if you go to use Firebase Auth, it's got all kinds of methods, but we can mix in some more, or we can blend in some more opinionated stuff. So we can actually go ahead and implement a sign-in with Apple. And I've done this before, and it's only like a couple lines of code, but when you're done with it, then you can just call Firebase Auth.instance.sign-in with Apple, or you can use that mix-in. And you can start adding in stuff that's more opinionated. So we have like a sign-in with Google Flow. And then when you go over to things like storage is a good example. You can have one where you can upload an avatar to a certain bucket with a certain file name. And all of these things is just a really nice way to go ahead and be like, okay, so we've got our storage service. You know, we're going to upload an avatar. We're going to upload like media for a post. We're going to upload all kinds like other stuff like that, like maybe an audio recording if you're building some kind of audio social app. And then you can even have like a backend developer come in here and start building out these extension methods and just supercharging your Firebase services without really having to do anything else. Now, the interesting thing about this too is that you actually get like a certain amount of loosely state management built in. So for example, when you're blending stuff into Firebase database, there's actually, from my experience, there's actually like a repository layer built into the Firebase database package or implementation on the native side. It also has like offline mode and all that stuff that you guys have probably already heard of. But because of that, what you can do is you can just kind of hammer data into it and then be listening to it in other places in the app, and it will instantly show up. It's not synchronous, but it's like that level of speed. It's like instantaneous async calls. So you can really just start pushing data in and listening to stuff in leaf nodes of the widget tree. And you can get you can start building out functionality like in really short amounts of time. And the API ends up working out super well because again, you're just mixing in that Firebase services mix in, and then you can access those items and just start building stuff out crazy fast. So that's the first one I wanted to show you. And so now we're going to move on to actually a topic that I just recently came across, which was doing stuff in Flutter with Redux, which is kind of funny because it's a topic that like is almost a little bit passé because, well, I think there's a few reasons for it. It seems to me that when Flutter first came on the scene, Redux was kind of a popular state management method. And I think at that time we had stuff like built value for doing data classes, but it was kind of verbose, and I don't think a lot of people were really a lot of people who are newer to the community weren't like very serious about using those kinds of tools. So I think that people kind of came into Flutter and they tried out Redux. They saw Redux Dart. They saw how verbose it was. They saw all that boilerplate, and they just got kind of turned off. And since then, we've had other things come up like block pattern, which then led to block package, and people starting to look seriously at change notifiers, because that the change notifier class is built into Flutter. And if you wire it up with something like scoped model or provider, then you can actually like build out some pretty nice state containers pretty quickly. But I think that people moved on from Redux really quickly because they didn't like the boilerplate. And what's interesting is that just about a month ago, I was brought into a new project. And when I showed up, the project had been, a lot of the architecture had been spec'd out by a web developer, and their default, because they were a React developer, their default was to reach for Redux. And when I came into the app, I was kind of brought on to kind of look at things and make sure things are heading the right direction. And I took a look at the state management. And when I saw that they were using Redux, I remember thinking to myself very clearly, like we have to get rid of this. In Flutter, we don't use Redux. We use things like block. We use things like change notifier with provider and a couple other options. But pretty much across the board, I would guess that most Flutter developers just turn their nose up at Redux. And that was the reaction I had. And I remember kind of looking at it and thinking to myself, like, man, we really got to get rid of this. But then almost in my head, I could hear one of my mentors who, if he's watching this, he'll know who he is. But he basically said, one time he said to me, we were working on a project and I wanted to do a rebuild of it. And I remember him saying to me that most developers are not self-aware enough to realize that thoughtful refactors are a superpower. And what he meant by that is, I believe, is so many developers, they see something and they're not familiar with it. They know how they would solve these problems with another architecture. And so their first instinct is to tear out what they don't understand and put in what they do understand. And I remember him really stressing to me that the better way to go is to not switch architectures, but instead to bend and flex the existing one, and try to see what you can do with it. Because a lot of times what you'll find, and this is true, I have a short background in mechanical engineering. I think this is true in any engineering field. When you're like super familiar with something, there's an amount of bias built in where you really want to do something that you're comfortable with as opposed to trying to learn from it. But one of the super fascinating things about software is that software is just a collection of patterns, and if you follow the patterns through, you can really start to shake out lessons that can apply to so many other parts of software and can really inform the decisions that went into that particular project. So I was sitting there looking at this Redux architecture, and I thought to myself, you know what? Instead of just throwing this thing out, I know from experience and I know from being taught by my mentors that throwing it away is the first thing that you want to do, but it's usually the last thing that you should do. And so what I did is I really decided to challenge myself to investigate Redux as a pattern that could work in Flutter apps. Because like I said earlier, I mean, it seems to be the community's opinion that nobody uses it and nobody should use it. And I really wanted to kind of question why that was. And I wanted to also question whether it was true that people don't use it. And I discovered a few things that I found really fascinating. And I wanted to go through just a basic Redux app example, and then maybe talk about things that I kind of realized along the way and directions that I think that we could go as a community. And I really challenge people to look at what's out there. Unfortunately, a lot of the packages are bit rotting now, and with null safety coming through, it looks like some of them are destined to rot even further. But I've been thinking about actually taking some of these packages under my own wing to get them up to null safety and kind of keep them current. I haven't committed to that, but it's something that I'm kind of toying with. And I think it's important because what I'm finding is, and a lot of you who have used it in the past in web dev might know that it's actually a pretty good pattern. And I think that a lot of the problems that people had with it, I think you can get past them with some of the advancements in Flutter and Dart that we've had in recent years. For example, in particular, freezed data classes, and also extension methods. So let's go ahead and just kind of get started. I'm not going to go over the Redux architecture itself or the strategies there, because you can find all kinds of information about that online. But let's go ahead and just dig into a couple things here. Now, the first thing that people complain about, admittedly, is boilerplate. And I actually have some examples of people complaining about boilerplate. So here, and they're totally founded, by the way. There is a lot of boilerplate in Redux, and I think that it's a fair criticism. So too much boilerplate with Redux, I hated it and quickly moved to something else. I totally get it. I think a lot of people have done that. Clunky is the least you can say. I don't know about your app, but when I tried it 2 years ago, action classes, reducers, and effects, it was a bit too much code for my taste. That's why I moved to MobX, which is a perfect thing to say, because for those of you who have used MobX, it's like the polar opposite of Redux, in that you just have a bunch of reactive fields and it's all code generation. But we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about this here. So I heard someone once say, I think it was in that thread, say that another word for boilerplate code is boring code. And that's not, and they went on to say that's not such a bad thing. And I actually agree. So here we've got freeze data classes. And the reason why freeze data classes are so interesting here is because, like built value, they have a way to do copy with, and they generate to and from JSON methods. I know built value does a little bit differently, but they both achieve a similar outcome. And freeze does it with less boilerplate, in my opinion. But if you look at this, really, this is just two items. You have the class name, and you have one particular argument for the constructor. And so in Redux, you basically dispatch actions. There's a reducer that looks through the actions, sees what the action is, and then it mutates the state, and then it returns that mutated state. And that's Redux in a nutshell. So we're going to go through. We've got our actions. We've got hydrate store action to get data into the store, which is important for dev tools, and we'll get into that later if I remember. We have things like create a to-do, add multiple to-dos. If we're doing an async fetching operation, we can just set a little flag that says that we're fetching. You can delete the to-do, update, toggle, and then you can do something like set a visibility filter. Now, it's kind of funny because you look at this and you think to yourself, man, that's a lot of boilerplate for things that could just be fields. But when you look at it as use cases, it's actually not as crazy as you'd think. And you can go ahead and you can test each of these individual use cases very easily. What I found when I went to use this architecture is that, I mean, testing was was so simple. It's literally like, let's add to-dos and check that they're there. You know, let's create a to-do, let's toggle it, let's update it, let's delete it. And that's it. And so we've got the actions here, and we're going to go ahead through here and we'll talk about the models. So these models, this is like the base store. This is the app state for the base store. And freeze lets us do the defaults, and also gives us the copy with, which we need for our reducers. And it gives us the serialization by default, which is going to end up being pretty important later. So you can see we've got the app state and we've got a basic to do with task complete when it's due, and then the visibility filter. So now we're going to get to the reducer. And this is an area where I think that one of the biggest complaints that I heard in some of those threads was that if you're looking at the code and you try to follow, like let's say let's see if I can pull one up. Okay, so let's say you're in this add to do dialog and then you want to follow code through the create to do action. You get here and it's kind of a dead end, right? You're like, okay, so where do I go from here? I don't really know how this is implemented. And I tried to code through, but I don't have it imported, so we can't do that. But it struck me as interesting that you could take this part of the reducer and you could go back to your action, and you could in theory go ahead and, not on this directly, but there are some other ways to get methods on freeze classes. You could actually go ahead and put some kind of like static reducer function on there and co-locate it. So I think that there's some ways to reduce that. Let's see here, what else we got? So we'll go through some of the reducers just to give an example. So we got the hydrate store, which basically takes the persistent state right here and just fits it right into the store. We've got, of course, our to-do actions. And then we also go ahead and for when we've got dev tools, we can go ahead and handle that so that we can handle any kind of actions that are generated by other tools without having any side effects, and still be able to throw a warning if there's an action coming through that we don't support. And you could even do like a throw unimplemented error on there if you wanted to make it more formal. So then we go on to selectors. Selectors are kind of interesting because Redux doesn't really have any derivative state built into it. It just has the core state, the data models. And so if you want derivative state, traditionally what you would do is you would use a selector to actually access the app state and turn it into derivative state. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it ends up being a little wordy because you end up having to, in your code, you end up having to call something like complete to-dos selector, and then, you know, if you're doing static access, it could be redux.store.state, and not a lot of people want to do that. It's not very fluttery. It's kind of old school and functional in nature. But what I found interesting when I was playing around with this is that a lot of what you do with selectors, you can actually do now with extension methods. So using extension methods, you can do a lot of you can do all your derivative state with extension methods. And then if you run into a situation where you want to use selectors, because a lot of the selectors, if you're like combining selectors, you have a way to memoize the results. You can actually go ahead, if you're using this pattern in the app, you can actually you can actually use a selector behind the scenes and have it be completely opaque to the consumer. So I found that really interesting because that in and of itself, you get to use a lot of the same performance, and you get to do a lot of the same optimizations you would otherwise. But you also get the ease of access and discoverability of being able to say like app_state.pass to-dos instead of having to go through and I deleted it, but having to go through and call it like I said earlier. Now, I'll show a quick example of thunks, and then I'm going to go on to the free stuff, which I think is the most important thing. So thunks are kind of a funny way of saying, let's have a asynchronous method that might like dispatch something, await a future, or do some kind of network call, and then dispatch other actions after that. And it's kind of the first way that you can start getting into asynchronous calls using Redux. So in this case, what we're doing is we're fetching adventures to-dos. So we'll set that we're fetching is true. We'll mock a long network call, and then we'll add the to-dos to build a canoe, paddle the Allagash, and build a log cabin. And then when we're done adding those, then we'll set the fetching action defaults. Now, what's interesting here is that thunks are a little bit clunky, as the name itself is kind of sounds like it's clunky, but there are other options. And for those of you who have used Redux in the past, you'll know about sagas and epics. And what I found really interesting about sagas, I think it was sagas in particular, is that they actually follow a pretty common pattern now in Flutter, which is those union events where you have like idle fetching or idle loading, success with data, and then error with error message. So if you look into sagas, I believe that if you're a block fan, that you will find that it matches a lot of the same mental models that you're used to. So that's kind of interesting. So that is thunks. Now we're going to get onto the part of the Redux, which I think is probably the most compelling part, because you can look at this and say to yourself, okay, this is kind of clunky. I prefer dealing with methods instead of these actions. Although, as I understand it, if you're in the block, then you're used to dealing with actions, so maybe that's not a problem for you. But what's super interesting is that you get a lot of tooling for free with Redux. So because we're using freeze, the entire state tree is serializable, which means that it's really quite easy to persist. So I'll give you a quick example. We've implemented a storage engine here, which is really just converting data to something that can be stored by shared preferences and then back again, which makes it multi-platform. And it's not the fastest thing on the planet, but it's never failed to work for me, and I've never had performance issues with it. And here in where you create the store, you can very easily add this persistence layer just by checking if there was any persisted state, and if there was, you can put it up front in front of initial state when you go to hydrate the store, and then you add it to the middleware, and that's it. And there's nothing else you have to do. You don't have to handle persistence in all of your state classes. You don't have to handle it for individual fields in MobX. So you can basically persist the entire store with about a 5 to 10 minute setup, and then you never have to think about it again. So that, I think, is a massive benefit of Redux that I think people overlook. The other thing that I think that people overlook is that because everything is coming through the store as actions and then out into the store as diffs, you can actually add a logging middleware to it. And that logging middleware can be anything. It can be local logs, it can be remote logs. And again, it's just, you drop it in and it just worked, and you never have to set it up for anything else. You don't, you do 10 minutes of setup and you never have to think about it again. It's done. That's it. And I think, I mean, a lot of people don't really worry too much about logging, but if you look at any like decent sized app, the amount of time that gets spent in logging stuff thoughtfully is actually quite extensive. And so if we're generating all those strings with freezed, and then everything's coming through the store as actions and as state diffs, then getting that stuff out for free is actually quite a decent time saver. So I think that people don't really appreciate how much time that saves. And then the next thing I'll say about this, before we go on to some additional thoughts, is I have not seen this in any other state management system in Flutter, and that's the ability to use dev tools. So I'm going to try to do a real quick example here. I have it set up, but we'll make sure that it's actually working. And for people who've done web dev, you'll look at this and you'll say, oh yeah, I've seen this before. But maybe you missed it. Maybe you wish you had access to it in Flutter. And for people who haven't done web dev before, who've done Flutter dev only, this stuff can look like absolute magic. So I'm going to make sure this thing is working. See if we can add a to-do. And if it's not, I'm going to go ahead and do a refresh here. Okay, that's up. That's up. Great. Okay. Now this gets to that hydrated store piece. So the reason I do the hydrated store, because you could easily just do an initial state. The reason I do the reason why we hydrate the store is because then it allows you to get all of that state in right up front for the purpose of looking at it through DevTools. So let's go ahead and we'll add a couple adventurous to-dos. And we will go ahead and say, okay, we're going to delete this one because we don't need it anymore. So we'll go ahead and, okay, we're going to build a canoe, paddle the Allagash, build a log cabin, and then somewhere in there we will finish up this live stream. Go ahead and save that, and then, we're not done with that yet, so we'll leave it. But if you come in here, what you'll notice is that as I was doing that, all of these actions were coming through into remote DevTools. And you can actually kind of click through and you can actually see what the entire state tree is. And it's really interesting because when I've worked on web projects that have access to this, we use it all the time. But when I work on Flutter projects, I don't know if it's because we have access to hot reload where they feel like they can just play around with it more, or maybe because we have better access to debug tools, they feel like it's not so important. But being able to actually watch the actions come through in a way that you can see what the diffs are, I think is incredibly useful. And what's also interesting is you can even go ahead and see here. You can even go ahead and you can scroll through the state changes. So it's got a built-in history model, and you can use it to actually, there you can see that's in the middle of the loading state. So when the loading was done, that went, and then there you go. So anyway, so this is now we're going to have it throw an error, of course, but Let's see what happens if we restart this, just out of curiosity. All right, we're doing all right. So that I think is something that has quite a lot of implications for people who are building declarative Flutter apps. And what, like, back when Redux was first being used in Flutter, for example, we didn't really have any declarative navigation available to us. But now with Navigator 2.0, which is a whole other topic, it kind of gives us a glimmer of being able to do declarative routing. And once you can do declarative routing, then you can have all your router state in the tree and have it all declarative. And you would be able to actually scroll through and see people navigating through different parts of the app. And what this allows us to do, one of the things that this allows us to do that's really interesting is actually to go ahead and start thinking about doing things like if an app crashes, then you can do a state tree dump and send it off to some sort of error reporting service, some kind of crash reporting service. And then your developer can actually take that state tree dump and they can import it through DevTools into your Redux app and be able to put the app, if everything's declarative, which I think we're getting close to because of Navigator 2.0, you can put the entire app, you can put your entire development environment back into the exact state that it was in prior to crashing. You might have to throw in maybe a different like user token or something like that. But you can get it right back to where it was, and you even have the opportunity, if you are able to also dump like the last 5 actions, for example, you would even be able to, go to where it crashed and then back 5 actions, and you'd be able to move forward and back. And that has huge debugging implications that are already being used by web developers. And I see no reason why we couldn't also use them with Flutter. So I think that's something that people are aren't really like thinking about when they look at Redux. I think that what happens is what's happened is people made up their mind about Redux. I think that people made up their mind about Redux in the early days, before we had access to declarative routing, before we had data classes with full serialization that people were comfortable with using, and before we had access to extensions. And I think that it gave birth to a lot of really great state management patterns. But there's something about Redux, it's hard to put my finger on, that it's like I'm looking at a glimmer of an architecture that in Flutter with these new tools could give us the ability to build very large applications with very low complexity. And I'm just going to share a couple tweets that I think are important to keep in context and might be a little bit interesting. Some of them are indifferent, some of them are glowing, and we'll just go through them fairly randomly. So in support of Redux, this is from Gunter. It says, I find it's good for beginners. If they follow some simple rules, it's hard to make a big ball of mud. So code review and a nudge here and there are enough to keep the code maintainable. With Angular, I use NGRX and it's much sleeker. Dart's type system makes it quite verbose. So again, it's a verbosity concern, but it is still a pretty glowing review all the way around. Mohammed Guler from Superlist says, we use Redux at Superlist as well. One big advantage is it is good for beginners. If your beginners have programming experience, you just tell them the rules and they follow until they get used to using Flutter. John Ryan has a mixed review. He says, I think about Redux as the command. I kind of think of Redux as the command pattern. It's not always great for big apps. Some people would agree and disagree with him there. But he says, but for certain screens or small apps, it's really handy. It's also easier to test in my experience. That's something that I've been finding too, is that the testability of it is very straightforward, much more straightforward than I anticipated. This one is a little bit of review of indifferences. A Redux is out of fashion, but it's fundamentally reduced function. What's there to hate? I think it's more the issue of it not doing enough automatically, which I think is really important, because, and this is what I find really interesting, is that a lot of state management systems do a lot of things automatically, but they also miss out on some things like persistence logging, dev tools. So it's almost like Redux gives you access to some things that we just don't even think of as features. And I think that if people got access to them, they'd appreciate them more. Craig said, I've done mountains of Redux and JS, and in my experience, Redux core strength is that its complexity is always constant. This is what I'm seeing glimmers of personally. Whether you're writing a blog or Gmail, if that's true, this would obviously make it a better fit the more complicated your app is. And this, I can't really say the same about any other architecture, although he does go on to say that block is kind of in this category. So that said, I've also found his boilerplate to be extremely prohibitive. Again, another person who's talking about boilerplate, totally valid, because I'm rarely writing anything actually intense enough to really capitalize on Redux. For my Flutter apps, freeze plus Flutter block provide that sweet spot of a less boilerplate Redux. Now this is interesting too, because in that thread, people went on to compare block with Redux. And when the block package first came out, I remember my first reaction was, it looks to me like this is flux pattern done with streams and some like async star, some Darty things that the other programming languages don't have. But he says Redux and block are really similar. Reducers are kind of like blocks. Actions are kind of like events. State is state. And then action creators are implicit in Flutter block, but worth replicating. Unless I've overlooked something, it's a question of which boilerplate you prefer to capture in snippets. So it almost seems like it nets out. And the other thing I'll say is that Max Lapides from Tonal said that Tonal Mobile is built on Redux with built value because freeze didn't exist in 2018. And he says that Redux has been good for managing data state, but our current implementation leaves a lot to be desired. And I can't speak for Max, but it'd be interesting to know what he would think if he had a chance to take a look at Redux again with some of the new tooling and things like extensions and freezed and other, and the potential of fully declarative navigation. It would be interesting to see if that would help solve the implementation issues that he's alluding to, or if he would still be, or if he would still have the same issues. And then finally, we've got Gunter again saying, a colleague set up Redux remote tools for Flutter. It's not fully working out, but I find it really cool. I'm using the same dev tools for Angular. And then he basically asks about whether there's any benefits of freeze because he's using built value. So he's using built value to access a lot of the stuff that I showed you today. So that is the long and short of what I've got to share with everybody today on the stream. And I just want to say, one of the things that I find really fascinating is that a lot of developers really latch on to whatever is the newest thing. And when you get down to it, especially in state management, a lot of the patterns that are being released as packages are just people kind of re-rolling the same basic patterns over and over and over and over again. And I feel like in the world of front end, we've been through so many iterations of state management that I'm not convinced that each time it's re-rolled that anyone's actually gaining any net benefit. I think it just shifts the concerns and the issues and the pros and the cons around. And I would challenge people to really give Redux another look, because while I agree that it does have issues in terms of boilerplate, I also think that it does some things for free that cost you a lot more than you might expect in other architectures. And for that reason, I don't think that it's a net loss to use Redux. I think that it is totally viable. And if, like me, you run into another project, you start working on another project that's brownfield code, and it's using Redux, instead of turning your nose up at it, really give it a chance and see what you can learn from it, because you might actually be pleasantly surprised with what you can do with it and what it can teach you. And that's what I've got.
Luke, this was excellent. Thank you for what you've given. This is I love a rehash of different ways of considering how you can manage state and how you can do work with extensions. Just to do a little bit of housekeeping, if anybody wants to ask questions, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. One is you can just use the chat. The other is we can invite you up to the stage to speak. The way we invite you to the stage is you can either just say in the chat, hey, I want to chat, or you can raise your hand at the very top right. And we can have up to 16 people on here. So for whatever that's worth.
Party.
But yeah, we can have a party. This tool maxes out at 100,000 people, which is pretty cool. If you have questions, this is the perfect time to ask. We do have two. I guess, well, Ryan, you've asked them. Do you want to?
Yeah, I had a couple, I guess you could call them basic questions. So the first one was, and I think you kind of touched on that a little bit in your talk, but it might be nice for you to rehash it. Why would you use Redux instead of Block?
Yeah, so I think that there's nothing wrong with Block. Okay, there's nothing wrong with Block. There's nothing wrong with Change Notifier. I have a personal preference to use Change Notifier. I guess what I'm saying is there's nothing wrong with Redux. And I think that there's this misconception in the community that there is something wrong with Redux. And I'm challenging that head on. I'm saying, listen, you look at Redux, the packages are starting to rot, which I think needs to be fixed, and it's something that I'm actively considering fixing. Because it would be a shame to lose this pattern completely. I think it's old gold in a way, if that makes any sense, where it's like a lot of people know how to use it. You can bring web developers into a project using Redux. You don't have to teach them anything. Block doesn't really exist in any other world other than Flutter. I know that it's been ported to other places, but you're not going to call up like a Swift developer and be like, here, write this Swift app in Block. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? Just like same with web developers. So I have no problem with Block. It's just that Redux is almost like this, it's taken as like a given that pretty much every front-end developer has at some point used Redux. And so I think that that alone is a power that people don't really appreciate. And I just think it gives you so much stuff for free that I had just completely ignored. Robust logging is important. DevTools, I don't know that it exists in Block. If it does, I would love to know about it, but I haven't seen it. The ability to dump the entire state tree and then rehydrate it at a later date for the purpose of debugging. I'm not aware of anything else that does that in like 5 lines of code. So there's all kinds of stuff like that that I think is super important. So it's just some things to think about. Someone's correcting me saying that Block has DevTools. Now that I see that, I'm definitely going to check it out. But that is one of a few examples, I think. And I should be clear, I'm not up here saying that Redux is better than anything. I am the first person, I will be the first person to tell you that I think that every state management solution that has, been popular in the last 10 years has applications. And I just think that it's unwise to pretend that Redux does not have a place in Flutter apps. I don't think that that's fair.
Yeah, I actually did not know that Block has dev tools, so I'd be interested in playing around with that as well. News to me. Another question that I had is, what do you think of the Redux inspired packages? So I think the most popular one might be Async Redux, but then there's also VX State, Meow Channel, RX Redux. I don't know if you'd heard
And
of
there's
any of
also, what
these.
is it, Fish Redux, the one from Alibaba, I think it
Yep.
was.
Hmm.
Yeah, so this is full disclosure. I haven't played with those because I've been playing with the core tool set. But I think someone could make an argument that they exist for a reason, because I think that people realize that the pattern is worth preserving in various forms. I have a suspicion, and I don't know, obviously, I can only be over here suspecting, but I have a suspicion that Fish Redux exists because of a lot of the Redux packages rotting. I don't know that that's true. I can only guess, but it's something that came to my mind when I was looking at their package.
How big of a lift do you expect it'll be to avoid the rot or help bring it up to state?
Well, what's interesting is that I was looking at the packages, and most of them have a null safety PR, but the people who created those packages, they've gone AWOL, it looks like. So I think there are definitely people out there using Redux, and there are definitely people out there making the PRs to keep these things fresh. But it just looks like the people who were using Redux were using Flutter early, and then maybe they moved on to another state management system, or maybe they moved on from Flutter altogether, and they're no longer around maintaining these packages. And so there's just nobody to triage those pull requests. I've tried to reach out to a couple people offering assistance, but I haven't heard back. So I think a lot of these people have just moved on to other communities.
Fair point. Any other questions, either in the chat or outside? I know Ryan is getting us these dev tools. Yes, awesome.
Yeah, I want to see these for sure.
Thanks. Thank you for the link.
The other thing I'll say that I find interesting, and it'd be interesting to hear Felix's take on this. I think it's Felix. It seems like Block was designed to take the best of Redux and try to rewrap it into something more consumable in the world of Flutter and Dart. And I don't know if that's something that he would confirm or deny, but it's something that I start to see glimmers of when I compare the two architectures.
Yeah, that's definitely the feeling I've always gotten, is that it's kind of like it adds the things that were missing to the original implementation of Redux, things like being able to do side effects that were, glaring omissions from the original Redux implementation.
Yeah.
Also, by the way, Luke, kudos on using the term mental models and doing it appropriately. That always makes me smile.
I don't remember.
You did. So I have this as well as the YouTube stream up at the same time, and I put a comment in the stream because I can't do this while I'm recording it. But I linked over. There's I don't know if you ever listen to any books from or read any books from Charles Duhigg, but he does a really good description of that specifically, and I hear that term often misused, and you did it very well. So
thank you. I appreciate that. I'll take the compliment any day.
Sounds good.
Yeah, another thing that I thought was cool, not necessarily a question, was I thought the idea of using a mix-in for your Firebase services is pretty nifty. I'm definitely going to take that.
Agreed. Yeah. No, I greatly appreciated that, plus the power that you can see with extensions. I thought that was I think there's a lot more that I can learn on that. So I'm definitely going to be rewatching and trying to test it out in some of my own code.
It's definitely worth playing with, because if you have an app that's heavy Firebase, you've got something that looks like a database, something that looks like media storage, something that looks like analytics. And those are oftentimes services that people write from scratch. So it's like, why not take those and just start adding your opinionated methods to it and then just access it that way? And I just found that it was just an absolutely blazingly fast way to build an app without really giving up much at all. And what's cool too is because they're extensions, you can break them up into multiple extensions if they get too large, and you can just keep feeding them in. You can keep wrapping the functionality with some sort of wrapper class, like how I had that service class for I think it was user.service. So you can start namespacing it whenever you want. And the migration, when you do that stuff, is like really simple.
You had mentioned that. Was that also something that was easier to test, or was that more in the Redux discussion?
That was in the Redux. That was in the Redux section. From what I can tell, when you start building up Firebase, stuff like that, I think they have better tools now for integration testing. But I think a lot of that you end up doing, like if I was going to start testing an app with that architecture that I showed in the beginning, the first place I'd be looking is just raw integration testing, where you'd be integration testing like flows more than doing like unit testing. But that's just what I think of when I am trying to like fit like a quick building architecture with like a quick testing architecture, because I'm assuming that in that type of app you're trying to iterate really fast. And so wrapping the testing in some sort of integration test and doing flows just kind of makes sense to me. But I'm sure there's other ways to do it.
Got it. Thank you.
Anybody else got any other questions?
So I guess, so we have a couple options that we could do right now while we are waiting for the second section of this meetup. I think Chris is, I don't know if he has joined yet.
Chris is here.
Yes,
he's
okay.
Joined.
So what we could do is we could just invite him up to the stage and keep going, which is probably going to be, I think, the easiest flow. And then after this discussion, if anybody is interested, we can show you some of the interesting things of this tool, where if you were, well, I can't see this because I'm up on the stage, but you can go to the lounge and you can actually do breakout groups and have discussions in between. So Chris, we're going to add you onto the stage, and Ryan, I will let you take it away.
Cool.
Hey, all.
Hey, Chris. How's it going?
Good. I don't see myself. I don't know if you see me.
No, it doesn't.
Button at the
look like
bottom left for turn on video. Should be in red.
Ah, yes. There it is. Hey.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad. So for everybody who's on, Chris Sells is the product manager for the Flutter team, correct?
Oh, no. I am but one of a team. It takes a village to make a Flutter.
Well, that's great. Well, he's joining us for Q&A. So this is wide open, not specific to the last couple of talks that we've had, but if anybody wants to ask any questions, I know I personally have some questions, but basically we're just gonna read through any questions that you ask either in the chat or on the questions tab, and we'll see if Chris can give us some answers.
Yeah, let's call it Stump the PM.
Chris, do you prefer hardball questions or softball questions?
Whatever you got.
That's fair.
So I can.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say I can open up with one. This one is actually kind of an abridged version from our first talk this afternoon. What is a good use case for Flutter for web?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So, I've noticed just the web in general evolving in kind of two directions over time. We try to do two very different things with the web. We like to have, flowy content where you've got text and images and videos, and you can resize the window and it all flows, and you get responsive apps and it all flows on your mobile and etc. Right? So that's kind of the document, web pages document, and of course that's what the web was originally built and designed for, right? However, over time, the web has grown in capability, and people started using it to build what is traditionally an app, right? This idea of however much screen real estate you give it, that's kind of the space of the app. Just like if it was a mobile app expanding to fill the space, or a desktop app expanding to fill the space. And over time, these became, higher and higher quality and more general purpose. And the benefit there is that it's in kind of an instant distribution mechanism, right? You go to a web URL and bang, you're running an app. There's no install step. And if there's updates, the next time you go to that app, boom, you get the updates, right? So, we've had a couple of names for this kind of app style. We've called them progressive web apps. We've called them single page applications. But the hallmark is really, it's not, this document that you're reading, but this, content or this, app that you're interacting with. And so it's rich and interactive, and honestly, it could as easily be a desktop app or a mobile app as it is a web app. But it's an app, and it's this latter thing, this more advanced, richer, more interactive thing, where Flutter Web shines, because you can you can take your mobile apps and make it work on the bigger screen and use Flutter Web, or take your mobile apps and keep them on the smaller screen and use Flutter Web. You can build a single source code base that is responsive and adapts to the space and the input mechanisms, and distribute it on the web. The thing that I like most about and of course with Flutter Web, you get that core benefit of the web. You serve to a Flutter Web app, there's no install step, you get the most recent version, right? It's just there, which is pretty great. So that's the kind of thing that Flutter Web is for. It's essentially, and all of our platforms, what we're really trying to achieve with mobile support and desktop support and web support is that you can say, I'm going to build a Flutter app, and these are the kind of interactions that I want to have, and these are the kind of screen sizes I want to support, and these are the kind of input modes I want to support. And then you can decide, and by the way, I want to ship it on Android, or I want to ship it on Windows, or I want to ship it on the web. You can make those decisions later, and you can grow and change those decisions over time as well. Because once you have your source code in Flutter, you can really take it anywhere.
Yeah, I can springboard off that, actually. I think, Chris, that's like an awesome summary for sure. The project that I'm working on now is actually the first full Flutter Web project that I've been contracted to work on. And that app you can describe it as a kind of like a console dashboard for people who are like handling leads and live chats and those sorts of things. And it's a perfect use case for Flutter Web because it really is at its core an app. It's not like a document style website. And what's so funny about it is we're at the point where we've got it running on Flutter Web because that's our build target. But we actually do a lot of the development on Mac OS because we have access to hot reload, and they're almost identical, right? I mean, they are identical visually. There are some differences on the platform channel side, but beyond that, it's like we're developing in Mac OS because it's so fast to develop, and then our actual deploy target is web, and we're basically shipping a desktop web in the browser around, I think it's like 2.5 megabytes of JavaScript, like all in. I think maybe Canvas Kit's on top of that as well. I can't remember the exact numbers. But when you look at it that way, I mean, that's like a fraction of the amount of data you need to ship a desktop app, which would end up doing about the exact same thing. So it's pretty amazing in that type of use case.
Oh, totally. And it's funny you mentioned you're doing all your development, using Flutter Desktop and then deploying on Flutter for the web. One of the reasons we put the beta, in Flutter 2, we just moved all 3 of our desktop platforms to beta. But we put it on the stable channel behind a config flag to enable that whole idea of, the Flutter simulator, right? That the desktop is really a great way to build and test your app with all those features you mentioned, Luke. And then, of course, you also test it if you're going to deploy to mobile, and you test it if you're going to deploy to web, and blah blah blah. But a lot of developers are using that desktop platform as a way to do development as well as a shipping target.
And one thing that I found that's really nice about using desktop for development is that it kind of enforces some Flutter best practices. So to give you an example, we had a situation where people were putting assets right in the public web folder. And so by switching to using the desktop for development, it enforced, for example, putting assets in the right place. And then that actually unblocked a lot of, it actually unblocked and juiced a lot of our movement on mobile, because we were being forced to get all our ducks in the row to be able to ship to multiple platforms. So that was kind of an added benefit of being on desktop is, if it works on desktop, there's a really high likelihood it's going to work on Flutter Web. But if you're only building on Flutter Web, then it leaves some avenues open for people to do things that might not work on desktop or mobile.
Well, it is interesting too. I mean, the interesting thing about being able to say I'm going to write my Flutter app and target it everywhere is that we find people routinely 80, 90, 95% of the code just works. It just
sure.
And then when you test it, you find some idiosyncrasy on that platform, this platform, and you want to add some responsiveness here, or some support for the web or for a mouse there, or something like that. But that is an amazing property of Flutter, is it just works. And that is the amazing thing that the Flutter web team did, right? Because a desktop essentially gets to use the same renderer that we've been building mobile for 4 or 5 years, right?
Right.
Whereas web, that's a brand new renderer based
Sure.
on CanvasKit. So that to me is the fact that I have many times done what you do, Luke. I develop my thing on desktop, and then I test and deploy it on the web. And it is amazing to me that the performance on CanvasKit is just like native performance, just like my desktop app. It stuns me how well it works, and what an amazing job the Flutter web team did.
Yeah, I'm personally all in on CanvasKit myself. I think it's an incredible renderer for web.
On a similar vein, if you're developing for desktop and for web, do we have any general directions or guides or areas to point to if we're specifically optimizing for keyboard shortcuts?
Yeah, that's a good question. As we add, richer support for keyboard and other mouse and other kinds of things, we're busy optimizing several things about Flutter, and among those are our docs and samples. We have recently added a bunch of sample code to show you how to do things like focus management and handling keyboard shortcuts and things like that. But if you're not seeing what you need, that's just a bug, and feel free to file that in our repo, and we have folks that are always looking to include me included, making sure that our docs are up to date and cover the use cases we need. And that's just a function of where we are, right? I mean, first class keyboard and mouse support is pretty new for us relative to the other kinds of things that we've had in Flutter for a while now.
Yeah, absolutely. There was and thank you. There was a question earlier that was asked. I think it was specifically talking about Flutter for web, but since it compiles to JavaScript and can be deployed anywhere, is there any preference about where to deploy it? Cloud Run, Docker container, etc.
Absolutely, you should put it into Firebase hosting. That is the number one. Actually, it's
point.
funny. I mean, I said Firebase hosting, but there's probably 6 other technologies at Google that allows you to host your Flutter-based website as well. Let alone all the other places. Honestly, whatever works for you works great. I personally put my stuff up on Firebase hosting. It's free, works great. It's like every time I make a change to my app, it's one command line and boom, it's out in the world. Yeah, it makes my life easy. But of course, in this day and age, there's an infinite number of places to host static content for a website. So yeah,
Yeah, that's
honestly,
the nice thing.
I was using GitHub Docs, and then they started charging me $5 a month to do that, and then I moved to Firebase hosting. And I mean, that was it. That was too much. $5, I couldn't deal with it. But obviously, different apps have different scalability and reach needs than my little samples, right?
Also, just to springboard off that, we in that Flutter web project I've been alluding to, we have just started using Firebase hosting preview channels along with GitHub Actions to do our pipelines on the front end side, and it's like smoking fast. We can deploy previews for like 3 or 4 different environments in like 3 to 4 minutes. It's just incredible.
It is amazing, isn't it? Right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, the cool thing about one of the many cool things about Flutter Web, it turns out there's a lot of technology in there, is that it uses the same Dart to JS compiler that the ads team at Google has been using in Angular Dart forever, for years and years. And Angular Dart's been around for a decade, and we have been optimizing that compiler for a long, long time. And so and optimization is not just in speed, but of course in quality of generated code. So we get to benefit from all of those optimizations that frankly started before Flutter even existed. So we get to stand on the shoulders of giants there. That's pretty cool.
That's great. Yeah, that's wonderful.
I had a follow-up question for Flutter for Web. Does WebAssembly have a future in Flutter Web?
So that's a really good question. So you think, gosh, all the years we spent optimizing the JavaScript output, and of course, that's on top of all the years that the browser vendors have spent optimizing their JavaScript engines. And of course, we've been optimizing our code based on the optimizations they've been doing. Can we get, performance benefits, size benefits, latency benefits from moving to WebAssembly? And the answer is we're looking into it for sure. We've done a few studies to see not just what the benefits are, but what would it take to actually move to WebAssembly if we decided we wanted to. We haven't taken that step yet. Certainly, you'll hear about it in probably some Flutter event in the future if we decide that it's benefit to the Flutter community. But that's really what it boils down to, right? Does it make Flutter developers' lives better? Does it help make their end users' lives better? And that's really how we make these technology decisions. So you'll see it when it happens, if it happens.
If you don't mind me asking, have you guys talked about the future of hot reload on web? Because that was one of the things we noticed first when we started working on Flutter Web.
Yeah, so Luke, what you're referring to is that we do not, on Flutter Web today, have a feature we've come to call, well, hot reload is the short version. The full name is really stateful hot reload. And the whole point of hot reload is, you change your underlying widget tree, right, in your widget implementations, but the actual state stays the same, right? Which is just provides an amazing experience, right? Where you can actually, the way that works for me is, instead of banging out a bunch of code and then running it and waiting for an emulator to pop up and, test to see if it works, when I come in the morning and I'm going to write some code, I run whatever is the current version, and then I start banging on the code. By the time I turn my head, right, I get to see an update of what that code looks like, which is a magical experience. We the basic problem is just the implementation of the protocol between the Chrome debugger and the Flutter debugger. It's a different protocol, different analyzer in the back end that does the work. We did a very early on. We saw that it was going to be really hard to turn on full stateful reload. So, but we did the thing that we could do, which you have now, but you might not have noticed you have, which is even though we don't do stateful hot reload, we'll keep you on the same page. So
Sure.
if you've navigated 6 layers deep and you do a hot reload, we won't pop you all the way back and make you go all the way back down again, right? We keep the navigator stack. We keep you on that same page. And we find that while it certainly doesn't solve the whole problem, it is a lot better than not having that, right? It makes a big difference to people. Is full stateful hot reload on our list? Absolutely, it totally is.
Certainly, if others have other suggestions for this, but one of the things I've done, if I load it in VS Code, which is my preferred IDE, and I have Android and iPhone at the same time, if I'm using web, I'll also have that just open in terminal, just so that I can not deal with the shifts that I wouldn't see with an Android and iPhone. So that way I can keep all 3 of them open at the same time and adjust the Flutter for web when it made sense to do so.
So are you using the feature in Visual Studio Code that we enabled that allowed you to have a single Flutter app running on multiple platforms simultaneously under the same button? So you've got yourself a little mini Flutter octopus going on there.
Yes, I do. And I, whenever I will either live code or give demonstrations, it is frequently with an Android on the right and an iPhone on the left.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that is my standard state whenever I'm developing for mobile first. And if I was working on Flutter for web as well and wanted to see how the layouts would look in a responsive environment, I would just run Flutter run in a terminal just for web, so that I would not. I just found it was easier.
Yeah, it's. I'm glad that. I mean, this is John. We built this feature for you, right? You would be able to say, hey, I want to build it for multiple platforms. We want to see it as we make changes on both the platforms or all of the platforms we're supporting. So if there's any regressions, we can deal with them right away. That's why we built the feature. The actual craziness, I've drug up on stage at Flutter Interact, right, to have 7 devices all connected.
Yeah, I remember that.
The same source code at the same time. The entire team thought I was crazy to go and push on that. But I just couldn't help myself. I drew it on a whiteboard one day and I just had to make it real. So
yeah, no, I mean, it's super useful, especially when you're testing specific pub.dev packages that may have different interactions for the different layouts. And this is where it's been of greatest help.
That's awesome. Good news.
Thank you. I guess while we're on that, are there any examples of Flutter that's being used for alternative platforms outside of mobile, desktop, and web? And we know the announcement from Toyota from 2 weeks ago.
Are you saying those 7 platforms are enough for you? You're saying
yeah.
Watches.
Well, yeah,
that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, so I remember the Google I/O demonstration about I always mess up the term. I'm sorry, but the Nest Home Hub, like the Max,
sure.
And as well as for wearables. I guess those are the specific questions. But then, things like Raspberry Pi or other smaller devices with which these layouts can be visualized.
Yeah, so there's turns out there's a kind of a lot of ground to cover there. I'll start with Raspberry Pi because that's easy. We've actually one of the Flutter members a couple of years ago, actually, just to test that we were doing something that could go to embedded devices, made an implementation of Flutter available for the Raspberry Pi as a kind of an example. Hey, if you want to move Flutter to your embedded platform of choice, here's Raspberry Pi. Here's an example of that. And we know that has been successful because Well, Toyota, and there's been others that have been experimenting with it and moving Flutter. Ultimately, the goal for Flutter is everywhere there's pixels to move, and enough resources to get the 4 MB of the Flutter runtime going. Then we want Flutter there. But obviously, this is not work that only the Flutter team can do, right? We are a very capable team, but a relatively small team, considering that we have a platform that now supports 7 different platforms. And by the way, actually, it's not 7; it's 8, because you mentioned the smart display devices. All of the Google apps that run on those devices, those are all written in Flutter as well. And so, we support platforms internally for Flutter development as well. Some production, some still experimental that we haven't yet shipped. So we do a lot of that. But fundamentally, there's a limit to how many we can do and support ourselves. And for that, we rely on the community to pick up and move things forward. For as one example, actually, I'll give you 2 examples of success stories in that case. One is all of the Linux desktop work. We had a placeholder embedding implementation for the Linux desktop that it served as a proof of concept and made sure that we had a good architecture. But when Canonical came in, they essentially started from scratch and they rebuilt it around GTK and made it industrial strength. And now, of course, they're using it in their own apps that they're building to support to run on Ubuntu, which blows my mind. That is amazing to me. That's where we are. So that's a success story where they built it and they maintain it. And we work with them to make sure that we're building something great. And then, of course, Toyota. They took that Linux implementation on the desktop and ran with it and made it work on the embedded automotive grade Linux. And then again, that's work that they do. We support them and we work with them as much as we can. But that's a platform that they built out and are using themselves. And that is really the only way to scale, right? That whoever cares about that platform works with the Flutter team and makes Flutter run on that platform, or even doesn't work with the Flutter team. It's an open source project. Feel free, make it work on whatever embedded devices you like. There is a long tail of possible devices where Flutter could run, and that's why we make Flutter available, so it can run anywhere you want it to run.
Yeah.
I feel like it would do really well on interactive kiosks. That's like one of the things I thought of when I first saw it a few years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And just since, well, I'm a healthcare provider, there's a healthcare spin. And one of the other people had also asked this question specifically for web. Finding the right way to host something that is Flutter enabled on a HIPAA compliant platform. And if we don't have options yet, then that is one that several of us are very interested in discovering, because I really do think that the opportunities here for design and easing the barrier to design definitely helps. So
yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I don't know what it means to be. We have not ourselves sought HIPAA compliance for the framework, and I don't even know if that's an option. Plus, I don't know what it means to be a HIPAA compliant platform. But essentially, any web server that can then serve up static files is a potential server for Flutter. So
yeah.
If there are any HIPAA compliant versions of those, then we should be good to go.
Yeah, and I think that is all we need to hear. Out of curiosity, what is something that you personally wished that Flutter offered?
Gosh, what do I wish for? What would I want? If I was on the Flutter team, what would I work on? So I am one of my jobs at Flutter is making sure we have a great end-to-end developer experience with Flutter. And I've been doing developer tools and services of one kind or another for most of my career. I'm a big fan. Developers are my people. And so for me, the kinds of things I tend to think about are tools, right? How do we make Flutter development even better, even easier? And the question we pose to ourselves internally is, hey, what's the next hot reload? And it's funny because hot reload is a really tough act to follow, right? I mean, if you look at the set of developer technologies that we build on today, hot reload in my mind changes my development experience as much as an interactive debugger changed it from using printf style debugging. I mean, there aren't a lot of technologies in that class that really change how you develop. One of the things I used the phrase kind of flippantly, but one of the things I'd really love to see is us ship something out of the box along the lines of a Flutter simulator, right? Like the iOS simulator or the Android emulator. The idea of a Flutter-based container that would host your app and allow you to change the settings. Hey, is the operating system in dark mode or light mode? What GPS coordinate is my app running in right now? And those kinds of things that you see in a simulator and an emulator today, but done in a way where it comes up instantly, right? That you don't have to wait for the emulator or simulator to start up. And the interesting thing about that is that means that we had such a thing. You could just install the Flutter SDK, which takes minutes. And most people already have either Android Studio or Visual Studio Code installed, right? So you wouldn't have to go through that process. You could be writing Flutter code and running it, in this simulator without having to do anything else, within minutes, right? It wouldn't take any time at all. And I think that would be fairly transformative from an on-ramp point of view, right? So that's something I'd love to see. The other thing I'd love to see, we did an experiment at Flutter Interact, something called Hot UI, which was kind of our thinking about a code-based WYSIWYG development time for UI. Of course, today, Flutter is all about the code, right? You got your code, and Hot Reload essentially gives you the WYSIWYG design surface, right? As you type your code, you get to see exactly what it looks like. And we haven't had a lot of people push back and say that's a bad model. However, as we expand, I mean, we have more than 500,000 monthly active user Flutter developers already, and that continues to grow. And even since we announced that number, it's gone up in a significant way. These are developers that come from platforms that have these WYSIWYG design tools, and you always want to meet your developers where they are. You always want to bring them in. You want the Flutter tent to be always bigger, right, and not smaller. And so there's a bunch of kinds of ways you could go into WYSIWYG design. Adobe XD has a plugin that Adobe built where you can start in XD and do design time and get code out. Hot UI was kind of developer-based way to kind of do that same kind of thing. Supernova had a way to load up sketch files and annotate them, and out comes Flutter code. So the community has taken a stab at this a few times, and from an on-ramp point of view, or working with your professional designer team, there's all kinds of benefits to such a designer. So you asked me for one, I gave you two, and I probably come up with a much longer list if you keep letting me talk here.
No, I love it. I absolutely love it. And Figma is my favorite design tool of right now, just because it reminds me of Google Docs, since multiple people can collaborate, though many tools do that now, but they have the components at the right where you can get your CSS styles or things along those lines.
And Codelessly is busy, hooking up into Figma and working to output Flutter code too. So, there's all kinds of these kind of tools in the works. I haven't seen any of them really reach the tipping point where it's the thing, most of Flutter development teams uses. But I don't think it'll be much longer yet before we have such a thing.
Yeah, so let's see, what else do we have? I had a question. Are there any examples of failures in Flutter either internal to Google or otherwise that you know of? And what were the lessons learned from that experience?
Nope. Every single line we've written since the day we started has been perfect. Just like every other software team I've ever been a part of, right? So, gosh, that's a hard one for me to answer. Here's the thing I'll pick. Here's a kind of a funny story where since when we shipped Flutter 1.0 on December of 2018, which is also when I joined the team, we had APIs that were deprecated, right? Already out of the box 1.0 APIs that we had marked as deprecated, we said you shouldn't use it because someday we're going to take it away. Except we never told you when. And we never set any expectations, and we never said, hey, we're going to take this up, as of this release or this date or whatever. And we just left them in. The first time we ever took any of the APIs away was 2 weeks ago when we shipped Flutter 2. That's when we actually started deleting some of these old deprecated APIs for the first time. And that was only because somebody on the team was smart enough to say, hey, we better figure this out. We set a policy, we announced the policy, and then, living up to that policy, the next stable release, that's when they started taking out the APIs. Well, when that was going to happen, we were worried that we were just now going to announce Flutter 2 and then break a bunch of these apps by finally taking out, a bunch of these deprecated APIs. And of course, we have access to quite a bit of source code, Flutter source code, right? I mean, all the plugins and packages on pub.dev, the majority of those are all on GitHub. We have that. It's All Widgets lists a bunch of open source Flutter apps. We have access to all of those. And of course, we've got millions and millions of lines of Flutter source code for our own Google Flutter apps internally. And so we were concerned that there was going to be some, non-trivial numbers of apps that we were going to build and lines of code in those apps. So that's where Flutter Fix came from, right? And that's something we announced, again, as part of Flutter 2, where when we deprecate an API and replace it with something else, what we do now, and what we did with most of the APIs or the majority of the APIs that we actually removed in the Flutter 2 timeframe, was we have this rules file that ships with the Flutter SDK that says, here's the definition of a deprecated API, and then here's what they should use instead. And the idea then is, you're using Visual Studio Code or you're using Android Studio, like most people do, and you get the little light bulb that says, oh, hey, you're using a deprecated API, let me move that code for you. Or if you want to do it in bulk in the command line for an entire project, you go to the command line and type Dart fix, and you'll get the usage, and it'll tell you how to do it for your whole project. And so kind of, that we feel like that's our kind of get out of jail free card, because what happens is over time, any API or any framework of any size with any number of users, as it gets bigger, by default, it calcifies, because the more lines of code you have written in it, the more painful it is for the team who's responsible for this technology and the users of the technology for you to make a breaking change, even if it improves the API. And so that's a bad state to get into, right? We don't want to get to a place where we have to stop improving Flutter because we're too afraid to break apps. On the other hand, we don't want people to say, oh my God, my app is busted. It's time to find a new technology, right? I don't like Flutter anymore. That's not cool. And that's what we get with Flutter Fix. Flutter Fix allows the Flutter team to continue to be agile, to continue to, when we made bad decisions in the first place and we decided, oh, we have a better way to do it, to, make those changes and put those rules into that data file so that people can just migrate their code, which means that we can break the APIs without breaking our users. And that is, the best of both worlds for the Flutter team. So have we made mistakes? You bet. Just look at all of our breaking changes, right? But the idea of Flutter Fix is that we have a path forward now to fix those in an automated way for people.
Yeah. That's excellent. And speaking firsthand, that's also the reason why I found Flutter, because I had something in Java, and I was time broke my app, and I was questioning if it was worth looking into Kotlin, and then learned of this new thing called Flutter in December 2018. So
that's how it goes, right?
It is.
When you're like, this, I don't like this anymore. This makes me unhappy. It's time to look for something new, and we don't want that. We want people to always be happy with Flutter.
Yeah, it's a wonderful path forward with the quick fix.
Cool. One of my whole things with upstream code is I think it's really important for upstream code to make explicit promises and then keep them. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that upstream code really has to do. And when I say that, I mean whether it's Flutter or packages or whatever. And that's why in some of my packages I've started putting at the top in the header, I put a promises section, and I'll write like 4 promises, like this will be accessible, this will meet this spec, we will accept any PR that helps us keep these promises. And so it's really cool that you guys went with a deprecation policy, because in my mind, that's a form of a promise. And it really helps a lot, just with understanding what you guys are promising to downstream code. So I just think it's important, and I was really glad to hear that you guys did that.
Great. One satisfied customer. I'll take it. Thank you, Luke.
I had a question for you. It's a little controversial, but within the Flutter team, would you say that VS Code or Android Studio is more popular?
It's kind of funny, actually. As you might imagine, this changes over time. For a long time, Android Studio and IntelliJ, right, which is fundamentally the same thing, was the only thing in use. And then Visual Studio Code came out, and it was this brand new thing. And I told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, and suddenly, Visual Studio Code is one of the most popular editor/IDEs there is. And so, we see the same balance internally, and we work at Google to support with Flutter development, to support the tools that people use internally. And those tools are a mix of, Android Studio, IntelliJ, Visual Studio Code. It's behind the community as a whole, right? It hasn't made it up to that same percentage split, but it's definitely on a trend, right, where it's growing use internally. But then there's all kinds of other, we use a monorepo with our own proprietary source code control system, and we have a lot of CI/CD systems that are based around that, testing that is all based around that monorepo strategy. And so we have to support internal Googlers who are writing Flutter in that tool chain. But increasingly, that means Visual Studio Code. Absolutely.
Are there, just building from that, are there any extensions to add to VS Code that are considered in the tech stack from Google's perspective?
Oh, that's a good question. Obviously, I'm a fan of the Flutter and Dart extensions.
Oh yeah, well, clearly, yes.
I have gone back and forth on a few others. I guess my other one that I would definitely recommend, although I would have some features that I would request for it myself, is the PubSpec Assistant tool.
Yes.
Where you can just say, oh, I want to add a dependency, I want to add a dev dependency, type some stuff, and it looks it up and throws it in and sorts them all and picks the latest and greatest version number. And yeah, it's all pretty cool. So that I use, and I think if you haven't tried it out, you should. It's pretty useful. Lots of people like the bracket colorizer.
Yeah.
There's when you're writing your build method, you got a lot of semicolon or parens and braces and brackets, and it's good for helping you balance those. But the obviously the only one that is absolutely required is the Flutter one.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any internal VS Code plugins?
I assume we do, but none leaps to my mind in terms of, oh my God, we have this thing that will toast your bread for you and bring it to you on a plate while you're coding. or whatever, right? Nothing I can think of off the top of my head. That's awesome.
Yeah, there's a few options for snippets, and I think there's 2 versions of bracket pair colorizer. 2 being the more recent one, and by more recent I mean I've been using it for over 2 years, so I don't know exactly when it came out, but
Sure.
yeah. What's after null safety? What's the next big thing, or can you tell us that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been looking at Bob Nystrom, the chief architect for the Dart programming language. He mentioned some in the Flutter 2 keynote that I think are pretty great. He talked about the ability to do type aliases, and we're looking at data classes, things like those. But the big one he talked about was this idea of metaprogramming. And metaprogramming is especially interesting because one of the things we did is we squeezed reflection out of the language. And the reason and for those who are unfamiliar, a reflection is the runtime ability to use type information as a way to drive program behavior. So, it's a really good way to, at runtime map, hey, I've got some results from a SQL query, let me map it to a type. Or it's really great for bridging type systems for XML or JSON. Of course, you can use it for all kinds of things, but lots of people use it for that kind of thing. But without reflection, it becomes now much harder to do that because you don't have that type of information at runtime. Now, the reason we did that was because we wanted our Dart and Flutter programs to be the smallest, fastest they could possibly be. And of course, we wanted our runtime to be as small as we could make it, and we wanted our code to be as small as we could make it, so that we can run on a wider range of devices. So the question is now, well, how do we get that functionality? Because you still want to do that, right? You've got some, data structured from another type system. You want to map it to Dart types or other kinds of things without writing all the boilerplate code, which is not only a productivity killer, but that's where bugs come from, right? You don't want to introduce a bug farm into your system by having to write all that code by hand. So metaprogramming is the way I think about it is think of it as compile time code gen, right? Where you can actually, and Lisp has something called macros, REST has macros. It's a similar concept. It's not something that we've invented, but it's meant to fill that hole where you can tell the compiler, hey, I see these attributes. I want to generate this code and make that part of the compile time step. We give full control to the developer because they can, they write their own compiler generators or pull down some code that has it in there that they can then use. But they don't have to write all the boilerplate, the error-prone boilerplate. So, and they don't have the runtime penalty, right? So we think of it as a win-win there, but it's hard to do. Other systems have had to do this. Other systems had. I've just mentioned a couple, and there's many more. And so we want to do this in a way that makes sense for the Dart developer. And so we're working on that, and I'm very excited about it. I'm fundamentally lazy, so I don't like to write that kind of code. So I'm looking forward to writing my meta programs.
Yeah, and just the term itself, I love because I have some bias here, but meta being Greek for above or beyond, but really it's probably closer to say by breaking the fourth wall. And my specialty of medicine is a meta specialty because you can do it from all specialties of medicine. We have a meta blog, and metacognition is the mental models that you actually had mentioned, Luke, earlier. So meta programming from the QC Flutter event 2 weeks ago. It's the first time I've ever heard that term, and it just made me smile because now there is another thing that is allowing it to be a little bit easier from the perspective of the end user. I think that's excellent.
Totally.
Chris, if I may, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, that is the whole point of Dart and Flutter, right? We picked Dart because it was optimized for front-end development across a number of axes. And the Dart team continues to do an amazing job of bringing new features that are going to really make an impact to the Flutter developers' lives. Null safety just being the most recent example.
So I was wondering, Chris, with the type of metaprogramming you're talking about, are you guys anticipating it to look like annotations like we have in code generation now, or is it like people can create their own new syntax?
My guess is it will be based around annotations, but I honestly don't know. And in fact, I don't think we've made any real hard decisions there ourselves yet. I think we're exploring options and avenues. The reason I think it'll be based on annotations is we have that as part of the language already.
Mhm.
It's a concept people understand, and we're already using it for, like build, right? There's a build runner, and that can, read annotations and make that available to you. So it's a smaller step. That said, who knows what Bob's cooking up? I honestly don't.
So I've heard some concerns. This might be a little bit of a hardball question, so bear with me.
Go ahead.
I've heard some concerns about people saying that they're a little worried about metaprogramming coming to Dart because Dart has always been such an opinionated language, and they're worried about people like community members coming up with whole new paradigms that could really confuse the ecosystem, as opposed to asking the Dart team to do like an opinionated data classes is probably the first thing I would think of. Do you have any opinions on that concern?
Here, I will give you a meta opinion on that opinion, which is, in general, the Dart team is very familiar with that feedback, very sensitive to that problem, right? Believe me that we fight hard always to make sure that the functionality we bring um, keeps the complexity to the absolute minimum, and you shouldn't have to feel that complexity unless you adopt that feature. So even if of course there will be some additional complexity. It's metaprogramming, right? You're writing programs that write programs. That is fundamentally just hard to think about, right? And even for experienced programmers, hard to get right. That said, hopefully, as in all of these things, the bulk of the complexity will be in developing the metaprograms, and adopting them for use should be easy. And I expect most of the use of metaprogramming to be applying attributes as opposed to writing the implementations of the attributes. So, and again, I don't know if it's going to be attribute based or not, but the idea is that the metaprogram author will have to experience some complexity, of course, which we'll attempt to minimize, but the user, it should feel like using any other part of the language. And I also agree that you're right, that, if we start making it possible to just change the language completely, then that has all kinds of, um, of negative side effects that we definitely want to avoid.
So I had a follow up to that, if you don't mind. Has there been any discussion about metaprogramming? Has there been any discussion about investing into metaprogramming so that the Dart team can then implement something like data classes?
I'm sure that has been part of the discussions, and my guess is the reason we haven't yet done data classes is because we want to get a little further down the metaprogramming path to see if that is something we could implement with metaprogramming before we start adding new features as a language. But now I'm just making some stuff up. Your guess is as good as mine as far as that goes.
So with the analogy of widgets being a declarative UI, and I give it where you're driving a car, you don't have to know what the pistons or spark plugs look like. You just put the key in the ignition and, put the pedal, step on the gas, right? Would this be, in essence, an attempt of doing some element of declarative metaprogramming to try and make this easier for you to work with something that is inherently complex?
Yeah, while I have a guess as to how I might apply, metaprograms to my Dart code, I honestly do not know what they have in mind for how to write them. So it could be declarative, it could be imperative, it could be AST based, and somebody hands you an AST and you screw with it and send it back. All runs at compile time. There's all kinds of ways to implement this. I've seen it done a bunch of ways. I do not know what we plan to do with Dart. And even if I did, what we're doing right now in our experiments may or may not have any bearing on what we actually ship to users. So at this point, I was just making stuff up.
No worries. I also want to point out, and I love that we have gone in a clockwise circle with our images and icons. I've enjoyed this over the time. It has made me smile.
Okay.
I have one other question, and then I want to leave it open to others as well. That was listed, but I don't think we've covered yet about Flutter Web GL in the current state or plan for that. Do you mind touching on that a little bit, or have?
I'm sorry, I missed your question.
The current state of Flutter Web GL.
So we base our implementation of Flutter Web on CanvasKit, the fastest renderer. That, of course, is essentially an implementation of Skia, which is kind of our universal API at the bottom level for Flutter, which is itself based on Canvas. I don't know actually to what extent that depends on WebGL. And I haven't heard the team talk about using WebGL for that in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do others on the line have other questions that they want to ask?
Yeah, I had another one actually. Going back to metaprogramming, I was wondering if the Flutter/Dart teams have talked about using it as a way to explore potential language features, sort of similar to Babel and TC39, and that process of how they introduce new features to JavaScript.
That's an excellent question. I have not heard that discussed, but that doesn't mean anything. The Dart language tends to be pretty heads down when they're doing their experimenting with these kinds of things, and they don't tend to get the pesky PMs involved until we push our way in. So I honestly do not know.
It would be an interesting way for the community to propose features.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. Again, depending on how it worked, right? If it was purely attribute based, then there would be no way to build these kinds of language, or rather, the kinds of language features you could build would be narrower. On the other hand, if you could just add any keyword you felt like, hey, you'd go crazy. Although, we'll see where we end up. I'm guessing it won't be there.
I did have a question for you. I think it was Bob was working on a records API, and it was records and tuples, I believe he was calling it. And I think it was Bob. I think he goes by Munificent on
That's
GitHub.
Right. That's right.
And anyway, so I heard that he was working on that. I don't know how far he got with that, but my understanding was that records was going to be a precursor to data classes. Do you happen to know if there's any connection there, or how far he's gone through that?
Yeah, I mean, so whenever we want to build a new feature, well, a lot of times in Dart we're inspired by other languages, and of course all the languages are inspired by each other in terms of good features and good ideas, and we want the good ideas from other languages in Dart, just like we've seen some Dart ideas make their way into other languages, and that's great, right? It's a big old world. I do know that when we think about like I'll give you the example you used, data classes from Kotlin. That is a great feature that fits well into Kotlin. It would be a mistake for us to pick it up whole cloth and drop it into Dart. That wouldn't work. It wouldn't fit in to the language. That said, there's a lot of great ideas in there that would work well in the Dart language. And so it's our job to kind of look at when people say, hey, they want data classes, they want extensions, they want mouse safety, they want metaprogramming, macros, whatever it is they say they want. It's our job to look at that and understand and pull that apart and say, what's the value in that feature? What are the components of it? What are the key bits? What are the syntactic sugar that makes it work well? in whatever languages we're looking at. And then think about, okay, how do we get the benefit of that in a way that when we add it to Dart, it feels like Dart. We don't want to start bolting on things that don't feel like Dart. That's why things like extension methods feel very natural as a part of Dart, even though they're pretty new. Why null safety feels very natural as a part of Dart, even though it's completely brand new. When we look at things, the records work was Bob's way of kind of exploring that space and thinking, what are the real benefits we would want? When people say we want data classes, what does that really mean? What are the features and benefits that we're looking to add? And so that's what we do. And so Bob is looking at records and tuples and such like as a way to experiment those features and what they would be like when it comes to adding data classes or something like it to Dart.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. Sure. Certainly, we all greatly appreciate this. I think with this in mind, I will probably end the stream, but I will keep this Airmeet open in case people actually want to see and see what some of the lounge is. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to use that, but you can actually go into different tables. So I will stick around somewhat informally over the next 5 or so minutes, or 5 to 10 minutes. But really, the questions asked here were greatly appreciated, and we all greatly value the time that you've spent to connect with us. So
absolutely happy to. I love developers are my people. I was very happy to be here.
Well, thank you. All right, so we will end this session, and I'm just going to click into room 1 in case you all want to see what that actually looks like, just because I love new tech, and this might be fun to mess with, but you won't hear us, so I'm just telling you now that I'm ending it. So thank you.